Well, hello everyone. Welcome. I'm glad that you've joined us to be a part of this session. And tonight we're going to talk about building healthy relationships. And I'm glad to have Laura Fess with us. And Laura is married to our son, Michael. And she has survived to tell the tale.
There's a medal in it somewhere. It's part of my crown.
Laura has a master's degree in social work from York University and is presently working as a counselor. And so she's been very busy during COVID. And I'm sure she's being a blessing to her clients. But we want to talk about relationships and healthy relationships. And Laura, maybe we can just begin before we get into a question. Just tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about yourself, just so people get to know you a little bit.
Well, I have been married to Mike for 13 years now, and we have two little kids, a 3-year-old who's turning 4 on Valentine's Day, so she's our love baby, and our little guy is 10 months old. And I worked in various, human service organizations over the years, and then had the blessing of pastoring for a number of years too. And now in this season, I get to work at a private practice, primarily with families and couples and teenagers and adults. And you're right, with COVID, there's a whole new kind of clientele that we're seeing, and it'll be interesting to see what they write, whoever they are, what they write about us and what these struggles are. Lots of anxiety people are experiencing personally, but also, I think at the beginning of all this, there was a lot of adrenaline almost to push us through the initial shock of everything. And now, a year later, I think a lot of that adrenaline has fizzled out, and people are just faced with what feels like Groundhog Day, with no escape, no break. Right. So, but I love what I do, and I love humans. Growing up, I always said I want to work with humans, and my dad said, well, you just got to find a way to pay your bills. And so that's what Mike's for. And so I get to work with humans and all kinds, and that's pretty much me.
It's interesting what you say about COVID. What do you think is the major stress point for people during this time?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that lends to healthy relationships is really clear boundaries, and those boundaries being predictable and obeyed, if that makes sense. And I think the personality type that I see struggling the most, I think everyone is struggling with this chronic change, chronic flexibility. I mean, we like consistency, but the personality type I see struggling the most is people who really need clear boundaries, and they need them followed. And if those boundaries aren't being followed, the anxiety and the real terror that someone can get gripped with goes through the roof. So from as young as late teenagers to CEOs that are in their 50s being gripped with fear, that kind of manifests itself when they go into public places and people aren't following protocols, or having to set boundaries with family members, say over the holidays, when families we're all getting together, and the rule following, boundary needing person is but they also are very people pleasing. So they really struggle putting that boundary up. And so that people pleasing boundary need is just kind of colliding into full on terror and anxiety. So that would be, outside of all the other stuff that's really obvious, that is a really interesting thing that has been popping up in over and over again, different age groups, different professions and all that.
Well, I hear you talk a lot about boundaries, like when we get together and we're chatting. So it seems that in a healthy relationship, boundaries is really important, eh?
Yeah, I would say that boundary work, whether you're talking about, because relationships are systems. And I think when we talk about relationships, we normally think of a husband and wife, but there's families, and then there's business, and systems get bigger and bigger. Even right now, we're seeing, confusion around institutional boundaries, government boundaries. Anytime those things get violated, we go into panic. And I always, kind of joke about, because people are like, oh, boundaries aren't that important. It's like, well, it's actually how God made us. When you think of creation was boundary setting from the beginning, dark and light, boom, land and sky, atmosphere and water. Like, so when land and ocean cross, we have a tsunami and things are damaged. When atmosphere and land cross, we have a hurricane or a tornado and things are destroyed. And so even I think in our very God-given nature, even when you think of the Trinity, like Father, Son, Holy Spirit, very specific, even though people are like, well, it's kind of confusing. It's like, well, it kind of, I guess, could be, but it's specific roles and specific personalities. And those don't get confused, right? They don't play different hats at different times and just to trick you. Mm-hmm. And I think that anytime that boundaries are violated, it shows that there is a lack of respect, lack of understanding, lack of communication, whatever it is on everyone's part. And the byproduct for the most part is an anxiety that people experience. Mm-hmm. And at an extreme end, it's trauma, mm-hmm. right? So when a leader violates the boundary of a child, trauma, right? And it's like, there's no good way for this to happen. So I would say boundaries are one of the key things when it comes to healthy relationships. And, there's physical boundaries, which is kind of what I'm, talk about why we have like safe church policies or plan to protect, mm-hmm. to keep everyone safe from an institutional relationship perspective. Yep. Then there's like material boundaries, when families or, financial abuse, when those things happen, that's a crossing of material boundaries. Even like resource boundaries, which I think you can see a lot when it comes to organizational or even staffing for those that run businesses. If they have staff members or employees who aren't clear with their boundaries and give up their time over and over and over again, they will experience a burnout, but it's because there's a boundary violation. And then I would say the last boundary being like emotional, right? When if you look at a child-parent relationship, if the child is supposed to fulfill the emotional needs of a parent, that's a boundary violation. And it happens all the time. I actually see that a lot for grown adults who are trying to fulfill emotional needs of parents and have been doing it their whole lives, and they can't because now they have a family and kids, and they just can't do it anymore. So I would say boundaries are a big part of healthy relationships. The other thing would be role clarity. So even in a family, we have a mom and a dad, or at least we have a stereotypical idea of what that looks like, and a child. And so where role confusion happens, and I see this a lot at work, is when a child becomes parentified. And so that's a role confusion that the parents put on the kid, where the little one actually fulfills parental roles. Okay. So they're either exposed to adult conversation. Sometimes when you see family separations and relationship breakdowns happening, and the little one is put in the middle of that, or having to just fulfill the emotional needs of the parent, like that emotional boundary violation, that parentification role is so damaging for kiddos. And as adults, the kid who's now a man or a woman can feel that they're the matriarch of the family or the patriarch of the family. Mm-hmm. Really not healthy, right? Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's all good stuff. That's excellent, Laura. Let's step back a little bit and just talk to us about, let's look at a healthy relationship, whether it's a friendship or whatever. What does a healthy relationship look like?
Yeah. Well, it looks like clear boundaries. Mm-hmm. It looks like clear roles and healthy roles. Mm-hmm. It looks like clearly communicated expectations. I think one of the most interesting things is that expectations don't ruin relationships. Ones that aren't communicated do. Mm-hmm. And so a healthy relationship would have expectations that everyone knows and everyone understands. And I think people think they're clear with their expectations, but they really aren't. And, you know, even when you think the 10 Commandments, they're kind of funny. It's like, don't kill people. It's like, really? Did you need to say that? Like, did you need to tell us that we shouldn't do that? And yet, unless it's communicated, people don't know, right? And they don't know how to behave, and they can't keep it healthy, right? Even, you know, don't cheat on your spouse. It's like, did you have to put that in there? And yet he did. Those 10 commandments are so obvious. Right. And yet in a lot of relationships that are healthy, there are communicated expectations. Even for Mike and I, something that it sounds so simple, but it helps so much is on Saturday mornings, especially with our lockdown. And we've been stuck, just us in this little unit for a long time. And just like on the weekend being like, hey, what is something that you're expecting from this weekend? And he can say, oh, I'd love to smoke some ribs on my barbecue. I'm like, oh, okay. So that's like a 6-hour thing. And, you know, or I would love to go for a hike, or I would love to go for a run. And you think like, well, wouldn't we know that about each other? This is what we want to do. But until you can communicate, this is what I'm expecting, you're going to fail each other, right? So I would say healthy relationships have really clearly communicated expectations. The other thing that they would have is that a healthy conflict resolution. There's basically 3 things you can do with conflict. You can avoid it, you can contend and go at it, or you can compromise and work together. And I would say that at least at work, what I see primarily is people just full on avoid conflict. And we, even as Christians, have like a weird morality about that. We call ourselves like, oh, I'm a peacekeeper. And the reality is it's, you know, you can only keep your peace for so long. And I like to explain it as like, you're keeping it, all of it, all the conflict, you're just keeping it. And eventually it turns into this big elephant in the room that everyone is tripping over, or a pile under the carpet that no one can move past until it's addressed. But I think often a lot of the times people just going to keep the peace is because conflict and communication skills are so lacking in our culture, that it gets volatile. Right. Right. And it just goes through the roof. And a really interesting thing that, you know, we're trained to do that anyone can do is watching people physically when conflict is happening. And so there's something called flooding, which is anytime your beats per minute in your heart go over 100, your body begins to secrete stress hormones. And the ability of the person who is flooded to hear anything that is being said to them is less than 30%. In some cases, it's like less than 10%. Really? And so, yeah. So when I'm doing like a couple session or a family session, when someone is flooded, and you can often tell because their artery is bouncing, you know, some people when they're flooded get angry and big, other people stonewall and they go totally, they look really at peace, but you can tell by how their artery is bouncing that they are not okay. And I think it's important to have some timeout skills to do that. In a workplace, there should be some HR stuff that is established where people can't be screaming and losing it, you know. But even then, when there's a power struggle or a hierarchy, it's hard to address conflict things. Right. But in a smaller system like the family, having, you know, ways that you can do a timeout so everyone can calm down, or, you know, even it sounds too business-like, but having an agenda for like, we're going to work through this stuff, I think is really important. But yeah, to summarize, I would say role clarity is really important, clear boundaries, clear expectations, and some way of communicating conflict is what's part of a healthy relationship.
Okay. So which is the major breakdown, do you think? What do people struggle with the most?
Well, it's hard. It all depends on what system is coming. Okay. I would say that in relationships like dating or husband and wife, a lot of the breakdown happens with expectations. And communicating those expectations. And that tends to be because of wounds that we have from an attachment level, an intimacy level, where we have this idea that if they loved me, they would know what I need. So if I have to say something, that means they don't love me. And that's some weird romanticized idea that I think culture has taught us.
Get that from? Like it's we expect people to be mind readers almost, right?
That's literally, that's literally the issue. I think what it is rooted in is attachment issues. And so for me, I have a 4-year-old, right? Up until the age of 5, she's developing attachment, but primarily between 0 and 2. And my job as the caregiver is when she has a need, I need to recognize the need. I need to address the need, and I need my response to be consistent. Okay. That's how you develop secure attachment. Now, if you had a parent growing up who was ambivalent to your needs, so sometimes they cared, sometimes they didn't, or they were really kind of volatile, or you couldn't anticipate their mood, their reaction, what it teaches you as a little person, genuinely before you're 2 years old, and then really by 5, that your needs are not important, that your voice shouldn't be heard. And you even begin to second guess, like, should I feel this way? Is this valid? I don't know. So if you've been invalidated by your caregiver, you could be 70 years old and have the loveliest people in your life, but those ideas of, I don't think people love me, I don't think I deserve this, will trip you up. It's actually really vulnerable to say, hey, this is what I need, or this is what I want, because you're opening yourself up to someone saying, no, not doing it. And so where there is the lack of ability to communicate your expectations, I think if we can with each other have a lot of grace and mercy and compassion, and being like, okay, you must be in pain. Whether you know it or not, there's something that has convinced you that you are undeserving. But that would be what I would say primarily, because you're right, it just makes sense. Like, just say what you want. And yet we really struggle.
Yeah, I think communicating what our needs are, our desires, how we're feeling, all of those things, those are big obstacles sometimes that people find it difficult to overcome, and just be honest and open and transparent about those things. You touched on something that I think is a really big thing, and that is our past, kind of our growing up, formative years, and some of the stuff that happens there. I'm pleased that in recent years, the church is opening up more to talk about those kinds of things and about emotional health. I think a guy like Pete Sciarro has been a big blessing to the church, because he helps us talk about some of those issues. Just talk to us a little bit more about how that affects us. You did give one example, but is there more that you could maybe say about that?
Yeah, I love his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. I think it's great for anyone to read, and it begins the conversation about what am I feeling and why. And back to being the parent of a child. One of the things that she is supposed to learn before I send her into the world is what she is feeling and what to do with that feeling. Okay. Now, how I grew up, and I'm guessing you grew up, and anyone older than us grew up, was in an environment where not that feelings weren't valid, but obedience was what was the most important thing. So you perform. And when you perform, you're not punished. And you avoid pain. Right. And so hence that generation of parenting. Well, what's interesting is in my office, I have a lot of people, men, women in their 30s, 40s, 50s. The oldest I've seen is like 81, who come in and they're struggling, whether it's with substance misuse, whether it's with an unhealthy relationship with food, whether it's with, really toxic self-talk. And underneath, as there's not just the attachment concerns, but there's a real disconnect between emotion and this feeling of, I don't know what I'm feeling. I just know it's not good. And it does tend to just come out as anger. Like if I'm not feeling something and it's bad, then it must be anger. But people don't know the whole range of feelings, right? And so there's some great books. One's called The Whole Brain Child, which I would recommend for adults, not just parents. It's just anyone who's like, why do I feel this disconnect between what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling? And how do I bridge that gap? Because that bridge is actually something called integration. And so when you're born, your real primitive part of your brain, the base part, is really the only thing that's functioning. So like my little guy, he came out and it was just feed me, and no communication. He can't, comprehend the world and, make decisions or think about consequences. He just screams, right? The older you get, the higher up into the brain you grow, right? Which for women, it's about 21 until that prefrontal cortex is developed. And for men, it's 25, which Mike and I got married at 20. Very scary. Undeveloped brains committing to each other. I still don't even know how it's worked out so far. But so what's happening with my 4-year-old is that she's in the left part of her brain, which is logic, and the right part of her brain, which is emotion. And so she is having these really primitive reactions, but her brain is trying to sort out what's happening, right? And so even today, we were outside, it's cold, and she's just melting, just losing it. And I'm like, what's going on? She has no idea. She has no idea. The behavior, though, is screaming, crying, defiance. Our generation, you, me, and before us, what would have happened to us is we would have been disciplined. We would have been punished. We would have been whatever your parents' strategy was, and you would have towed the line. Well, what integration teaches us is that instead of punishing her for a reaction that she has no comprehension about, is slowing it right down and saying, okay, what are you feeling? What is going on? Now, at first, she is like, oh, no, I hate you. I hate the cold. It's like, okay, well, you feel hate. You seem upset. Are you sad? I'm frustrated. What are you frustrated about? My mittens. What's happening with your mittens? So as we slow down and you can validate the feeling, she now understands the sensation in her body that doesn't feel good could be many things. And so the more that she trains that muscle, okay, this feeling is I'm scared. Okay, what do I do with this feeling? Well, when I'm scared, I throw things. Okay, throwing isn't the appropriate behavior, but the feeling is real. What are other options? When I'm scared, I can pray. When I'm scared, I can hug that teddy bear or my pink bunny or whatever it is. As we learn how to do that, then when you get to the higher, more executive kind of functioning, you can make decisions about the future that have consequences, knowing how you feel. Okay. So this is a funny example of how does someone end up in an unhealthy relationship that was unhealthy even before they got married, right? Their decision-making, their consequential decision-making is been shut down from the feeling source because they don't believe that their feelings are valid. So even though they're like, this is not good, I don't feel good, I've never felt safe, I don't think this is the one for me, those feelings aren't valid. And so logic says just, they asked, I'm going to commit. And so here we go. And then 30 years later, they're in my office and they're like, I don't think I've ever felt love. Like, what does that feel like? The cool thing is that you can learn integration at any age, right? Because our brains are they're always growing. Did you know that it wasn't until the 1990s that they realized the brain could continue to learn? They basically thought like, once you're like 30, you're done. Like that's all, like you can't relearn anything. You're just, you're screwed. But you can learn emotion, it takes a lot of self-awareness. And you'll hear people say like mindfulness and whatever that means, but it really is whatever that feeling is that's not good, is sitting with it long enough to be like, well, what is this? Am I feeling humiliated? Am I feeling nervous? Am I feeling stressed? And like I said, I will have people who are CEOs, doctors, really accomplished people sitting in office with a feelings word sheet being like, I think this is, humiliation. I think that's what triggers, and that's why I go big. And I think that's what it is. Okay, so let's remember what that feels like in your body. And the next time you feel that feeling, instead of lashing out at your employees, what is a way you can behave that feeling without the consequences being so dramatic? But that book, The Whole Brain Child, is so good, and will do an even better job explaining what I just tried to plow through.
So in the counseling room, when you're dealing with people who have broken relationships or struggling in their relationships, unhealthy
Yeah.
relationships, what are some of the key things that you share with them, and what are the tools that you give to them? You've just talked
Yeah,
about one, but are there other tools that you give people?
totally. I think a lot of the time what's important for someone to understand is where is the breakdown happening.
Mhm.
Okay. So we have, and this is what can be really confusing if you talk about relationships like family relationships, right? Is that we have healthy and functioning relationships. Then we have functioning and unhealthy relationships. And then we have unhealthy, dysfunctional relationships, right? And
Mhm.
so when you grow up in a family unit that's really, it's functioning, but it's not healthy, that can cause a lot of confusion, right? And so you can look back and be like, well, it was working, like it was fine, but something has happened along the way, and now this isn't working anymore. It's moved into not functioning, whatever that breakdown is. And so typically what we do is we, once it's assessed, okay, was it ever functioning? What is it? Is going back, okay, where is the confusion here? Is there a role confusion? And so a family breakdown is a great example of where it was functioning because of a power dynamic, right? A kid needs their parents, they need the food, they need the home, they're at their mercy, right? Well, where the role confusion can happen is when they move out into the world or whatever, something takes them this way, and the parent is still wanting to assert that dominance in order for there to be a relationship, right? It's going back and allowing that person to work through what is the role that I actually need right now, which is boundaries, which includes expectations, and go from there. Now, there's some relationships that the role is fine, the boundaries are fine, the expectations are fine, but it's just gotten awkward. Like it's like, people will say, especially with COVID, it's like, what do we talk about? So those are called relationship strategies. A really healthy relationship has a lot of strategies. And so what that means is, like, for Mike and I, it's like, well, we like watching Jeopardy. We like to cook together. We like our kids. Mike now likes going for walks. Yay, COVID. We go for walks together. We like camping. I could list all the things that we like to do together. And that way, if I lose my leg, well, we can still do these things. I lose my eyesight. We can still do these things. I lose my job. It buffers you from the things that life kind of throws in to your relationship.
Right.
Unhealthy relationships don't have many strategies, okay? Or low functioning relationships. And so an example would be, let's say my mom and I just gossiped and watched Little House on the Prairie. Like, let's say those were how I grew up and what we did. And then they cancel Little House on the Prairie. And I have this like moral awakening, which is a new boundary that says I don't gossip. Well, now my mom and I, we have nothing. And so you can sit there for a cup of coffee just being like, this is so awkward. Like,
Yeah.
and it's not that it's not functioning, but there's this weird something that's going on. And so to strengthen something like that, you just need to add strategies. Okay. And so if you're married, it looks like taking a dance class, or not that you can right now, but Zoom, YouTube, something. It looks like, diversifying what you have, even if it's not in common, but it's a strategy to connect with each other, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, a lot of people can be like, oh yeah, I know my co-worker and I, we sit down at lunch and we just vent about the boss, and it's gotten me so anxious, but that's it. And I don't know how to get away from that. It's like, well, you need to create a Pinterest board together and pin baby things, like.
Yeah, I hear you. Selfishness, where does that come into relationships? We're being self-absorbed.
Yeah.
I see that a lot.
Yeah.
I see people in their relationships drifting
Yeah.
because they kind of either they're oblivious and they're in their own world,
Yeah.
or they just kind of, just kind of settle in and they take their stand and there's no flexibility. Like,
Yeah.
what do you do in a situation like that?
Well, I would say that if there has been a big change, so if someone was very flexible and now they seem very rigid,
Mhm.
you know, that to me shows that there's been a change in boundaries, okay, or a change in a boundary need. Now, if you have a healthy communication relationship, you can say, "Hey, I've noticed that your boundaries seem really firm right now. You know, why is that?" And someone could give an example. Oh, I started school and so I'm totally swamped and I'm busy all the time. And so in this season, these are my my boundaries and what I'm capable of. And that's where boundaries and expectations go back and forth. Because in a healthy relationship, someone can say, well, I'm really expecting a phone call 3 times a week. And you're absent. And then the person say, I'm not capable of meeting that need.
Yeah,
What's
right.
another way we can do that, right? So in a healthy relationship, you can have that dialogue about what has changed, right? Um, that selfishness, though, at a really extreme clinical point, it would be like narcissism. Like there are some people that they just can't see anyone else's needs.
Mhm.
And they are the center of the world, and that will never change. That
Yeah,
will never change.
yeah.
But yeah, no, I would say that if you felt something, I would go back with what is the boundary that's changed here, and what is the expectation that's changed, or what is the role that has changed, because one of those has.
Right,
And
right.
if you can talk through it, you'll be able to be like, oh, that makes sense, no worries, and you move forward, right?
Yeah, right, right. And some people are just not self-aware. And so
Oh,
they're not aware of
yeah.
there even being a problem or they're,
Totally. Well, and that comes up with communication, right? So if there is a system that exists where, so let's say you're a boss with employees and you have no idea that your employees just hate you. Like none of them like you, and you're just this boss just living your great life.
yeah,
Well, there is clearly a communication issue where people don't feel safe, where they can say, hey, like how you ran that meeting the other week freaks people out. There's not someone that can be trusted.
right.
um, but yeah, there does tend to be, I would say there's a role issue, a boundary issue, an expectation issue, all muddled up with a communication. Ooh,
Yeah,
and so nothing's being addressed, but it will be one of those things.
yeah, yeah. Very
Yeah.
good. Very good. Well, why don't we just spend a little bit of time talking about how do we strengthen our relationships? We've talked about some of the breakdowns, we've talked about some of the key elements, but uh, just in a general practical sense, can you just talk to the folks about, you know, how do we strengthen our relationships, whether it's a marriage relationship or a friendship or a family relationship? How do we
Yeah.
do?
I mean, I think something you said that is so bang on is people are not self aware. We are not. Like, we wouldn't call it a blind spot if we could see it. Like it's blind because you have no idea. And I think that if you're experiencing a lot of relationship breakdown or a lot of conflict relationally, then if there's people around you that can speak into you honestly, I used to share an office with Lori Lynn Head, who's a pastor at Mapleview. And I used to say to her every like 6 months when my ego got strong enough where I think I could handle it, I used to say, okay, Lori Lynn, tell me, what is my blind spot? What do I not see? What do I not see? Who am I in staff meeting that you just hate? Who am I as a coworker? Just go for it. And I just be ready for, she was so mean and so honest that but it was good because you don't know your blind spot, right?
You bring up a great point. Why are we not honest? I think I know why, but can you talk about that? Like
Yeah.
why are we seem to walk on eggshells with one another,
Yeah.
and the truth doesn't always, like, what is that about, do you think?
I mean, it really depends on what kind of relationship we're talking about, right? Normally, it's because there is a power differentiation or differential. Like,
Right.
you know, yeah, normally it's like if I'm someone's employee and they are violating things and there's no proper HR department, a lot of the time the reason it's not addressed is because I have too much to lose, you know. Even in a family relationship, when you're talking about, let's say a kid needs to address something with a parent, I think kids are primitively just want their mom and dad to be proud of them and love them. And the thought of bringing something up where they could just be really rejected is so painful that it's just like, I don't think they're going to change. I'm just going to leave it because that feels like too much of an expectation on them. Right. And so it does get really complicated, but it does depend on the relationship, right? I think Lori Lynn knew that she could be honest with me because I was asking for it. Right. And so, okay, maybe that's a big thing is if you're struggling in a relationship and you're not sure what's going on, I think one of the first things is to full on say, like, is something up? You know, like, I'm giving you permission to tell me what is going on here, because I said that to her, she knew, okay, you mean it? I'm like, I mean it. I may not mean it, but I mean it.
So you're saying the person in power then, or the person who has the power, whether it's a parent or a boss or whatever, you have to work hard at kind of tearing down those barriers that would, it would inhibit people from sharing with us, right?
Totally. And that's where like organizations should have a board or an eldership or an HR department or, you know.
Right. But even I this is something that I've had to learn. I'm a pretty easygoing guy, but I guess I can be kind of scary at times. And so, I would hear, from via the grapevine, people saying certain things, and, they're afraid to talk to me about this, even staff people at time. And it just said to me, okay, I've really got to work hard at building those relationships and creating a culture where people feel that it's a safe place for them to come and share their concerns, their criticisms, whatever, so that we can have healthier and stronger relationships. And I think that applies across the board, whether you're talking about a parent and a child, or a boss and an employee, or even friends, because even by our personality, sometimes in friendships, um, one personality is stronger than the other. And we've seen this, like some people are like the Pied Piper, right? They've got all these people that kind of follow them around. And in a sense, there's an attraction to that, but also there can be an intimidation where, people maybe aren't totally honest with one another. So, so it's a big issue, isn't it?
Yeah, and that self-awareness piece is hard. That's why, one-on-one counseling with teenagers is a lot more difficult. I youth pastored for years, and so I thought teenagers in psychotherapy would be really easy. And it's hard because developmentally, they are not self-aware. Like, they have not crossed that developmental task yet. They're still in development phase. And that is a huge thing. And so a lot of us, how do you become self-aware outside of asking someone, like, what do you see? That reflective journaling of this is what's going on. This is like journaling is actually shown to be really helpful with self-awareness about what you're feeling, why you're feeling it, what's going on. And it helps you kind of out loud process with yourself and sort things into compartments. They did this, I did that, oh, wait, I did that. Then they did that. Oh, could this be, did I trigger that? Oh, maybe it was me. But then also I think, the practice I'm in is really secular. And so something that I think we have as Christians, which is so helpful, is even the values of being humble. Right. And even biblical conflict resolution, where it's like, bring a third party if you need someone to mediate. Like, all of those things are built in to help us, because it's like God knows that we can't handle the feedback. And unless we humble ourselves before him and allow our self-esteem, which can be so wounded from family, friends, whatever it is, to be found in him, it is hard to get feedback.
Mhm.
right? And
Mhm.
yeah, if that makes sense.
I think the two come together. I think,
Yeah.
the biblical principles and what we can learn, from secular sources. I think when we bring those together, that can really strengthen our understanding of how we should be operating in our relationships. And we've been talking a lot about prayer
Yeah.
in recent days here. And, if we have an intimate relationship with the Heavenly Father, then
Mhm.
he's going to be able to reveal things to us and speak to us about things. And he's going to help us discern things. And
Totally.
I think that's really key as well in our relationships, to ask the Lord to show us where our blind spots are.
Yeah.
Show us where we're not loving, where we're not compassionate, where we're not encouraging uh, in our friendships. So I think the two really come together. And
Yeah.
I know that
It's
you,
like David, search me and know my heart. Like it's just like there is a self-aware or on the journey of help me, help me.
well,
Yeah.
this has been so helpful, Laura. Just maybe in closing, if you could just talk to us a little bit, how can we help people as a church? Like, as a church, what should we be doing to help people build healthy relationships, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, with COVID, life has become really simple for at least for me. I'm stuck in this house and most of my clients are online. But I've had the opportunity to just be really local, like because I have to, I'm stranded. But the local life has become something really precious to me. And so as far as neighboring, like what does it mean to be a neighbor? And really believing that God put me in this house and surrounded me with these people for some reason. And as you know, in the spring when everything was shut down, we'd all be outside just at the end of our driveway, like, hi, I'm just waving, getting to know people. We lived here for 7 years, didn't know anyone, right? And as things got, more flexible or more shut down, going on walks with neighbors, making a meal for a neighbor. And I think the Bible says they will know we are Christians by the way we love one another. And it's not just how we love ourselves in our own little church bubble, because they don't see that. They don't even follow our Instagrams. Let's be honest. They're like, I don't know you had a potluck. I don't even care. I didn't even know churches did that, like, but if we can love and be relational with people, which I know it's just like, of course, like that's so obvious. Like treat others the way you'd want them to treat you, like just doing that with our neighbors, that is really impactful, and remembering someone's name, remembering the detail of what's going on, actually texting and following up. In my phone, I set reminders, like, because I'm a mom and life gets crazy and I swear I live the same day over and over again without a reminder. I just, one more meal, one more snack, nap time, bedtime. It's March. What the heck? But I'll set reminders, like text so-and-so, make muffins for so-and-so, walk over to so-and-so's house and see how they're doing, so it does kind of take a intentional strategy, but it's also like that, like with my husband, which I was really offended when I found out that he had tell my wife I love her in his daily to-do list. At first I was like, that crushed my soul. And he's like, but I tell you every day. I'm like, because it's on a list. And he's like, it's on the list.
Well,
You made the list. I'm like, okay.
Mike is a guy of lists. He has his list, that's for sure. But you brought up a great point. And I think one thing COVID is really teaching the church that, it's just not about coming to a building, but actually Jesus said, go. And
Totally.
the spiritual center really is shifting from the building to our neighborhoods, to the place where God has placed people in their
Totally.
community, in their workplace. And I think if we can just ask God to show us, how do I build relationships, strong relationships with people? How do I uh, hold up before them
Yeah.
what Jesus is like? I think that's really, really
Totally. And I would just say about the role, is that I think a lot of Christians do local with their role is I'm the Christian and you are lost. And people can feel that and they don't like that. That's not the role that they want from a relationship perspective. It's, are you my neighbor? And do you love me because I'm your neighbor? Is that it? Right. Because they can feel that tension of like, oh, you're my project. People, they can feel it, they don't like that. And so it's really, again, being self-aware. It's like, why am I doing this? I'm doing this because God has placed me here. And no matter what happens, I'm going to love. That's the role, right? And I think that will transform the world. It's almost like we're in a reformation. That's what it feels like.
I believe
it's kind
that.
of cool.
I really believe that. And I believe it's touching every aspect of our lives, and relationships are key to all of that. So thank you for your time, Laura. It's been great to be together.
Yes, virtual.
Virtually, yeah. And we've shared a lot of great things. I just believe it's going to be helpful for folks. So thanks again for tuning in. And if you need some help or just want to dialogue with us, please reach out. We'd love to talk with you. God bless.